Well, I knew of this place that you could go to if you were feeling really sad, and they called it the Hospital of Happiness. And I remember going in there and feeling relieved to have left the world outside, which was so complicated. I didn't know where to go, how to get up in the morning, how to tie my shoes. Every activity was burdened by complexity. Now, when I entered the Hospital of Happiness, I found that all that had changed. And when I entered and first talked to the doctor there, well, he was a very nice person. He didn't shout at me or curse or say anything out of line to me. He was just very pleasant. And I wondered why the whole world weren't like this place. It truly was the Hospital of Happiness. Now, I went there to be happy, to become happy, because happiness was a sort of journey for me, and, well, judging by where I now stood, it would be a very, very long journey indeed. And as I stood at the precipice of the Hospital of Happiness, I felt that truly there were miles and miles and miles of hospital floor to cover before I would feel I had reached the summit of happiness. But I knew that I was not alone in this, and I knew that the other hospital inhabitants, and indeed the doctors too, had all my best interests in mind, and that I would not be alone in this journey, and that instead I would have my hand held throughout it all. Now there was something serene about the lights in that hospital. They were all white and very calming to the eye. In fact, there was very little coloration throughout the hospital. It was mostly a bland but pale and pleasant and unthreatening hue of white. Now I found this to be incredibly soothing to my temperament, because outside the world was far too garish and colorful for me to bear. There were rules to be observed in the Hospital of Happiness. Now, I was even more disciplined in the Hospital of Happiness than outside in the real world, and yet I found myself to be much relieved by this structure. I found a lot of freedom inside this discipline. There were meal times, curfews, games, competitions. We had to follow this regime religiously, but they were all of a more mellow nature than any sort of discipline you would experience in the outside world, like going to school, going to work, or paying your bills. One of the most challenging things that can happen to an inhabitant of the Hospital of Happiness is finding yourself at that point in time when you have indeed reached what could possibly be called the summit of happiness. After having journeyed so long in this scape of white hue and bright lights and regular suppers, it can be quite unsettling to have to leave the Hospital of Happiness, to have to go and pick up your reward, because the reward is leaving, the reward is returning to the outside. But the wonder is, why cannot reality be inverted so that the whole world were a hospital of happiness, and that the vibrant, terrifying, unregulated real world could be encapsulated in a small building on Park Avenue? Now, the smartest of us would figure it out that you don't want to reach the summit of happiness. You just want to reach the penultimate peak of happiness. And you want to stay there, going back a little, regressing, going forwards a little, progressing, going backwards and forwards, but on average staying on the penultimate precipice of the Hospital of Happiness, never quite reaching the final level needed to graduate from this perfect isolation. I was fortunate enough to have some wise advisors on my journey, fellow inmates, and they told me, "If you are wise, Mary, do not go beyond the penultimate precipice, and do not return from that point either, Stay there, stay with us, sit at this peak, and look upon the higher peak, which you will never reach, thank goodness. Because once you reach that precipice, Mary, once you reach the real summit of happiness, they'll let go of you, and you'll be out there, where the real summit of happiness is not anywhere near in sight. You'll never find it, Mary. When you leave this place, you'll be back at sea level. You'll have not gone anywhere. Here, at least, if you stay on the penultimate precipice, you are somewhere. You are up, high up, almost at the top. But Mary, if you are unwise and you go to that top precipice, you'll find yourself tumbling all the way down again, and none of us will be there to save you. I took that advice to heart, and I stayed with my friends on the penultimate precipice. Now, I know the doctors had our best interests in mind, but they were very worried about this sort of behavior, and to keep them off the scent of our trail, we had to develop tactics to keep them from suspecting that we were purposefully staying there. We had to develop certain personality traits that would make it understandable or plausible that we were staying there not out of choice, but out of a practical inability to reach the summit. I had to exhibit the sort of personality that would suggest that my confidence would cripple in the face of high stakes, like making the final walk to the summit of happiness. And truly, through make-believe, I started to become that sort of person who wouldn't be able to take the final step to completion, who wouldn't be able to follow through, but who could come very, very close. Then came the day when one of my friends died. He had spent 70 years in the hospital of happiness, and had died at 92. This man had known these polished tiles and white lights all his life. He had all but forgotten the vibrant and sickening outside world that was waiting to grapple with all of us. Now, I don't know exactly what happened to me at this point, but his death was a little bit of a wake-up call for me. I said to myself, well, I am quite happy at the penultimate precipice of happiness, but maybe that's not enough. Maybe that's not enough even for me. About 2 weeks later, after my friend's death, 5 of us were sitting on the precipice that we inhabited on average all the time, and which we had agreed never to leave. I looked around at my remaining friends, who were all also aging. I was of the youngest of them. I turned to one next to me, George, and I said, I think I'm gonna go to the precipice of happiness, the summit, the real top. They looked at me like I had gone crazy. Are you crazy? Said George. Are you mad? Said Hal. Oh no, said I. I just don't think I can take the white lights and the polished tiles anymore. I think I'd like to tumble all the way down to the real world and start over. Tried as they might to talk me out of it, I stood up and I walked. The journey's been long. It's been miles and miles of covering the floors of the hospital. They say you need to walk at least 200,000 times around the hospital to truly achieve happiness. As it happened, the hospital of happiness was so wonderful to all of us, such a great relief from the great outdoors, that we intended to stay there for the rest of our lives. We had friends there. We had family there. We had happiness there. We had peace there. And I decided to forsake all of that. When I got to the top, the doctors were very happy. They started to applaud and they made me a certificate. On the certificate was a picture of a mountain. On top of the mountain was a little photoshopped image of me. I looked like a hiker on Mount Everest. and I had reached the top. It must be very cold up there. The following day I was released from the institution. I stood outside on the porch, holding my certificate. Indeed, although my journey was very long and perilous, and involved many difficult decisions and the loss of friends and family, who now remembered me and mourned my loss, now I looked ahead of me and saw that the road parted at the end of the drive in 2 directions. Which direction would I take? I decided it didn't matter. The topology of the real world was all too complex for there to really exist a true single summit. I knew I would never find the summit of happiness, because I already had. The summit can only exist in the hospital of happiness. Out here in the real world, I must look for my own little niche, create a settlement there, create connections with whoever happens to inhabit that place, that valley, whatever nook I decided to nestle myself into, and I would not be discouraged by the vastness of things. I would simply find my own volume and occupy it, and be satisfied with the fact that that volume would be filled with my respirations, with my evaporations, with my gases and juices and all that, little artifacts of me. And I'd be satisfied in the fact that this orb of meanness would follow me around, like a friend, like a ghostly friend, like a shadow of me. And with this companion of meanness, I would be able to conquer any adversary, because I would always have extra strength to offer to those in need, or to ward off danger.